talk about an AI model, machine learning or deep learning model, or a more traditional matching algorithm, what do we actually mean? What does it need to achieve for us? And what should you look out for when you're assessing these systems? Firstly, really, is the ability to easily view, edit, deploy, and tailor whatever matching rules you have. 59% of you have said, I can't accurately, define rules based on a risk-based approach. It's a core principle of what you really need to be able to achieve. One size fits all never really fits anyone is something that anyone that's listened into webinars before has probably heard me say many times, but it's absolutely true. So that's a really, really important concept. It's okay having a system, but if I can't manage that system and can't make the changes that I need to, you're going to be starting with one hand tied behind your back. But equally, then, once you are viewing, editing, deploying, and tailoring matching rules, below that, what do you need to tailor within those matching rules? So, of course, we've spoken already about different match rules at different risk levels, but maybe also that risk level is defined by certain different metrics within your company. Maybe you want to split out the screening process and thus the approach, the rules, and the risk based on things like line of business. Can you, segregate data and segregate screening processes so that you can screen different branches, different lines of business, different types of policies, whatever it is that you want to split out, and perform a different screening on? Can you do that easily? And then, of course, once you actually get into the match rules themselves, i.e., how strong, how tight, how loose, how weak do I want to make the rules? Some of the things that you're going to be looking for is, of course, fuzzy settings. But we say they're fuzzy settings at the field level because we feel that that's important. Most fuzzy systems will match at the either the record level or the full name level, maybe. But of course, we all know that when we write our names out, we are much more likely to make changes, I should say, or take liberties maybe, with our first name than we are with our surnames, for instance. Jackie versus Jacqueline, Bob versus Robert. So can you make sure that those fuzzy settings can be different based on the underlying context of what that piece of data is? First name, middle name, last name, date of birth versus country. Things like that are going to need different tolerances. You also need to look at things like name order handling. It's incredibly common that you'll have systems, different branches, different languages in different regions of the world where the standards for putting in names might differ. First name, last name, first name, initial, last name, and so on. So name order handling is something which is oft overlooked, but absolutely shouldn't be. You should look at what the capabilities are to accommodate different sort of orders of names and different standardizations. But then you've also got common name. Oh, go on, Steve.
I was going to say, I think this brings out some important points when thinking about, you have a system and you're looking at its capabilities and so forth. Matching that up to your understanding before you get into a system, matching it up to your understanding of what your population of data looks like. What are the characteristics of your names? And they may be, if you're a global institution, that may vary over your geographic operating areas. So making sure you have that sort of documented understanding of your data so that you can map that then to your system selection process and then your configurations within that system.
Absolutely. I likened it recently with somebody that I was talking to as to going and buying a car. You don't go and buy a car and just say, I need a car. You know what you need to do with that car. I need a large family SUV because I've got 3 kids, a dog, and we like to go camping and fishing. So it's the same concept. Looking at what your customers do, looking at what data you collect, and what you might have to accommodate for should inform that decision. Absolutely, good point, Steve. But then, of course, the ability to make changes and test those changes against live conditions before committing to them. And this is a really important point because there is often an approach that's taken that we can test it with some test data, whether that's just internally obscured data, whether that is synthetic test data. And some people still believe that the process of doing that is still going to reflect reality. Once we go live with the system, well, in our testing, we got X number of results, and these are what these results look like. Oh, we've gone live and it now looks completely different. Why is that? Well, you're not going to get an accurate representation of reality unless you use reality in the testing. So being able to say, these are the changes I want to make. How can I run those against real data? And how can I measure what the potential impact of going live with those changes is going to be and make an informed decision is incredibly important when you're looking for not just what the underlying model and algorithm is, but the tools that go with that are, which we'll get into a little bit more.
I would be interested to hear from the audience who has had a situation where there were changes made, a whole number of alerts that were created that were unexpected in terms of the volume, and what was done with those. Because once you committed in production to those alerts, you need to be very careful about just arbitrarily closing them out because, oh, they were in error. Well, why were they in error? If they did a match, what were the issues behind this? So you need to deal with with what results might come forth from changes. And if you do that in a production environment, you may be faced with a very large volume of alerts to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as Steve said, we'd love to hear from you on that. So if anyone's got experience with those sort of incidences and how you met that challenge, or what sort of operational impact it had on you for a day, a week, a month after that event happened, please feel free to put some comments into the questions box. Moving on then, we're also talking now about compliance-specific data management. We've already seen data plays a big part. The underlying list data you're going to use, the customer data you're going to put into the system. It's, or whether you're talking about, training data for an AI machine learning algorithm. The data plays an absolutely key role here. And when we look at the traditional approach, it is this. You've got your data sources, whether that's onboarding of new customers, whether that's your existing customer database, or data you're acquiring through a merger and acquisition, or maybe you're also adding in things like internal staff records, from HR. You're screening your suppliers. You take the data as is and you put it into a matching system. That's pretty much the traditional approach. But of course, we've already seen that can cause big problems. Maybe you don't have enough data in there. Maybe that data is poorly formatted, poorly managed. And you're putting it into a sort of generic matching algorithm. Of course, going forward, is it not the best practice to then say, let's put some compliance-specific data preparation in front of that process? We get the data, then we analyze, look at the data, and say, right, there are things in that data that need to be standardized. Some of our systems represent the United States as U.S.A, others as US, others as USA, others as United States of America. Whatever those standardizations on values need to be, right, we're just going to transform all of those to just USA as a country value. You might need to fix data errors, whether that is incorrectly entered information, whether it's deliberately entered as just a placeholder value. I haven't got the customer's date of birth to hand right now. I'll just put 1900-0101. Of course, there's absolutely no way someone that was born 123 years ago is going to be opening up a new car insurance policy or a new trading account. That's obviously a data error that needs to be resolved. And can it also identify hidden names? Joint account names, Mr. Kieran and Mrs. Jacqueline Holland as one name, and can it split them out? Or have you got things like trading as, care of in the customer application? And then only once that process has been applied, the data has been cleaned and standardized for the specific use that it's going to be put into, then it goes into the matching. And the ultimate end goal here is to produce better results through reducing risk, i.e. reducing the possibility of false negatives, care of, trading as names are a classic example there. Equally, you're going to reduce false positives by shoring up that data with good standards, making sure that the data is well populated. And that all comes down to reduced review time, resources and costs, reducing risk whilst also increasing efficiency. And it's very important to kind of highlight a discussion I had recently with someone we've been consulting with, where they themselves said, yes, we do have an internal data quality team. Absolutely. And technically, they're very good guys. The team really knows, data, but they don't understand what compliance need. They're trying to fix the data they know, how to fix, and for the purposes that they know to fix it for, which is the primary business function. But when it comes to compliance, some of the things that we ask them for, they don't have a concept of why that is and why it needs to be this way. And that's the point here. It's compliance specific. Your use case It's no good screening the same customer 300 times because they've got 300 policies, but absolutely elsewhere in the business, you need to have individual records for each policy. So, compliance has a different use case and for a very, very different underlying reason, an incredibly important one. So being able to have that compliance specific data quality is key to achieving some of those better results.
And this relates to a question that just came in, Kieran. What is M&A and compliance specific data management? So M&A being mergers and acquisitions, where your organization may be acquiring another organization and you're now responsible for screening the customer names that come from that organization. Well, when you're acquiring that data as part of that merger and acquisition, there may be a whole host of data quality issues associated with that as a result of different processes that existed at that other organization, whether that be in the capture of that data, whether it be in the requirements for what data was used in the screening, and so forth. So all those things now become your issue as the compliance person in the organization that is acquiring that other organization. So that's where the M&A part comes in. I hope that answered the question from the audience member.
Thanks for that question, Abdul. So next up then is, so we've spoken about data quality and its importance. Understanding how to use the data once you've done an assessment of it, once you've looked at it, it's important to know what can be achieved. So really you should look to develop your business rules, your match rules, based on looking at that data and of course the corresponding watch list data and looking at the reality. We worked with somebody recently where they absolutely said date of birth. It's an absolute key identifier for us. If we're not going to match on the date of birth, it shouldn't be a match. Set that up for us in the system. Well, we can do that. But did you know that only 40% of your customer records you've handed to us actually have a date of birth? Can you really rely on that? So being able to look at that and then say, yes, this is data we can leverage, gives you a big, big improvement. So by way of showing this, name only. Now, when you're doing name only screening, of course, it is the sort of the minimum expectation. Yes, we have to find if this person and their name is also on a sanctions list. But not everything is overly accurate when you're looking at just name. You screen global sanctions lists for things like Jose Gonzalez, you're gonna get back tons and tons of matches, guaranteed. But of course, once you start introducing secondary information, maybe we said, actually, we've got good address information for our customers, so we can also use country. You start reducing down the possible results you might have to review. Each of our individual customers, we always onboard them by getting a copy of their passport, driving license, or national ID. So we've got a reliable way to collect their date of birth information as well. Great, let's introduce that. And because we use passport number frequently, let's introduce that as well. All of those things, as you start to incorporate more data, but only once you've looked at it and said it's well populated and it's reliable, you can use that in a screening process, use that in your rules to say, actually, we can rely on this. So we're going to use that as secondary pieces of data to filter out a lot of the noise you would otherwise get with name-only screening. And then when we look at some other additional strategies, you've got matching individuals to individuals and organizations to organizations. This would seem on the surface of it like an incredibly simple subject, but it's still, again, very frequently mistaken. When you look at the actual underlying data that you use when talking about an individual versus what you do when you're talking about an organization, there are differences. So you've got names, alias names, and alternate spellings, which can all coexist at once, whereas organizations can only really be that name. They may have previous names, they may have group names, trading names, but generally speaking, not nearly as much as an individual might have coexistent aliases and alternate spellings. For individuals, you've got certain key identifiers like date of birth, and therefore from that age. You've got gender, you've got national ID and passport numbers. Whereas for organizations, you do have, for instance, date of incorporation, but it's not always well populated. And certainly you've got certain registration numbers, tax numbers, but again, not always necessarily well populated list data. And we often see people trying to take the approach of saying, well, I'm just going to take a record and screen it against all the records on the list. And then you lead to what I commonly call cross-matching. I've screened John Smith, and I've managed to match John Smith to John Smith's Plumbing Limited, John Smith Butchers, John Smith Brewery here in the UK, which is actually a real brewing company. It's unlikely that our customer, John Smith, is also going to be the underlying owner or managing director of those three companies, just by virtue of the fact that his name is also part of the company name. Simply by saying ahead of time, This is an individual. Please only screen this against individuals on the sanctions. This is a company. Please only screen it against companies on the sanctions list. Is going to give you immediately some very easy false positives to eliminate. You can just simply say, there is no way that this person could be that company or that company could be this person. They are two completely different types of entities. And going back to what we were talking about earlier on the poll question, configuring match rules based on a risk-based approach, it really should be forefront of your mind to be able to say, I've got loose rules, maybe I've got medium rules, I've got tighter rules. Those rules are going to have higher or lower tolerances. They're going to use slightly different secondary identifiers. And I can then assign that to a perceived risk level. So it might be that you use loose rules to something that's particularly high risk, sanctions, for instance, or other significant terrorist or law enforcement lists. You can afford to do that because there's a low volume of profiles. If you're going to be looking at all globally sanctioned individuals and entities, some analysis I did, I think back in October last year, showed there was just over 60,000. When you compare that to there being more than 2+ million PEPs, it's a small amount of data. You can use loose name rules, and you can afford that greater overall percentage of false positives, because ultimately the pool, the actual underlying number of screened profiles and results is going to be naturally lower. So you can minimize the risk of false negatives without taking a completely wide cast net across all risk. And then tight rules, maybe here you're going to be using things like middle name, you can be more stricter on. Date of birth, we're absolutely going to use as a secondary identifier. You can start to do things such as leveraging different levels or categories of PEPs, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail on the next slide. And you can minimize false positives by being tighter. But of course, there is always that need still to balance your operational efficiency versus false negative risk, missing matches. So you still need to be careful what you do here, but there is definitely more scope for being a little bit tighter on those low risk adverse media, PEPs and relatives and close associates and so on. So being able to configure things and configure different rules and assign it to a perceived risk level of the underlying hit, really important. And of course, we spoke earlier about utilizing your client data, and the more client data you can utilize once you've assessed it as being reliable, the more your matches go down. And we just spoke about PEPs and how utilizing PEP roles in tighter rules has advantages. But what might that advantage really be? Well, when you look at PEPs, refining those list profiles based on a targeted risk, reducing unnecessary matches, as I mentioned, globally, if you look at all PEPs listed across a number of different databases, you're looking at north of 2 million profiles nowadays. That's a lot. That's a lot of data to screen your customers against. And I guarantee you will almost certainly get matches for PEPs, who, yes, may have been the Secretary of Defense in Spain 30 years ago, but has long since retired. They may have been a provincial mayor or town mayor, something like that, 10 years ago, but have never held any position before or since. Question is that a risk to you? So as soon as you start applying filters based on that risk level and whether it does or doesn't interest you, for instance, we filter that down to PEPs, but only in higher risk positions, filtering out things like town mayors, city councillors of lower grade and things like that, and focus on national government, members of the judiciary, senior members of the armed forces and things like that. You can cut that in half, 1 million. If we look at things like high risk roles only and then say, well, what if they've only held those positions or currently hold those positions, but what if they've held those positions only in the last 5 years or 2 years? You can drop down from 1 million to around about 220. And I should have starred this as well. On that last one there, we looked at high risk roles only in the last 5 years, only across selected jurisdictions that our customers are known to operate in and we're known to operate in. Other jurisdictions that we have no business in, we're going to filter out too. So you can see there that, again, taking that risk-based approach by saying there are profiles that we care about, there are profiles that we don't, because it's just not high enough risk, it is not current, and it's not within areas that we do business in whatsoever, you can, again, achieve a really, really good efficiency saving. And then, of course, in terms of additional strategies, that visibility and predictability we spoke about earlier can't be understated. Whether you're talking about doing batch screening, real-time screening, I'm changing rules, I want to be able to measure the increase or the decrease in the match rate, the number of cases and potential matches that's going to generate, what new cases are going to look like, what are the old cases that I'm going to filter out in reality. is incredibly important, because this is the part where you have that control to say, actually, I made a rule, I've run a test against real data, I've documented what the outcome was, and that gives me the confidence that nothing is going to surprise us on Monday morning when we go live with those rules. But equally, the way that I've tested that is absolutely justifiable. I've got documentation of what the rule was. I've got documentation of the overall tests against real data, produced a reduction, an increase, etc. And then I can say that is absolutely demonstrable, but equally I can enable better resource allocation. I've introduced a new list, I've changed some rules. I know there's going to be a few additional cases. There's going to be 92, like we've got on the right there, 92 additional cases added come Monday morning when we go live. I'm going to warn my team. I'm going to make sure that we've got the resource allocation available. And transparency goes a lot further than just saying, I know what the outcome is going to be, or on a batch, so that I can provide resource allocation, I can provide documentation of my testing. As Steve, you alluded to earlier on, being able to understand what the technology actually does is key to being able to say, I am in alignment with the obligations and the guidance from the regulators.
That's absolutely true, yes.
So the ability to actually say, I can run real-time simulations, either using real-world data or synthetic examples, or a mixture of both, provide a breakdown of how each field was used, how each part of that record was calculated into an overall score, how that would be presented if this was a real-world case, such as that example on the right. It doesn't get much better than that. This is the complete opposite end of that black box. I put a name in, magic happens, a result comes out. This is, I put a name in, it tells me everything it does as it's doing the magic, and then I get the result at the other end. So I can be confident that I know exactly what it's doing, how it's doing it, and if I was to make a change to this, equally I can come back and test again. But equally, it should also show you things such as how words are translated and handled. So if you were to put in Vice Admiral Kieran Holland Senior, Esquire III, whatever that might be, there's lots of parts of that name that are not really the name. They're titles, they are prefixes, they're suffixes, they're company identifier words, LTD, PLC. Knowing how it actually handles the data and what parts of the data it is going to use in matching versus what it's going to ignore, just as important. Because it's data and technology, right? You've got to know how it's going to use the data as well as what it does with that data once it starts its process. And the biggest advantage of this is that once you have these tools and this visibility and that transparency of how the technology works, configuration then becomes facts-based. It's not based on guesswork. You're not making assumptions. You're not going with standard rules from the vendor. You're not just asking, well, can you implement the typical rules that anyone else in our industry uses? You're saying, this is the reality of what we have to screen. These are the reality of the resource allocations that we have. This is the reality of what it's going to do. And it avoids the kind of constant tweaking, retesting. I'm going to put a threshold at 85%. I'm going to drop it down to 80% and see what happens. This is facts-based configuration.